just in terms of the format, I prepared a really quick presentation, really short presentation about the highlights of PHP 8 from my subjective point of view. And then we'll go into a Q&A session. We'll do it in the channel, in the Facebook group, as it's usually done. I'll be able to answer questions in the next few hours, and even tomorrow I'll follow up if there are any unanswered questions. And this video, I think, should be available afterwards for anyone who wants to see it. And yeah, let's get started. So thanks, Andrew, for inviting me to present today. Today it's a special day because today is actually the day that PHP 8 came out. It literally came out a couple of hours ago. And PHP 8 is an important milestone in the evolution of PHP. And at the same time, it's important to be aware of some things, especially for the folks who are probably watching me or listening to me now, who are specifically interested in the WordPress side of things and how PHP 8 interacts with WordPress and vice versa. So let's spend a few minutes to cover the new things in PHP 8. So the first thing, that the kind of the trigger for the creation of PHP 8, the reason that this is a major version that comes out, usually for every major version of PHP, there was at least one major trigger, and in the case of PHP 8, it's the JIT engine. JIT stands for just-in-time compilation, more specifically in our context, and it's a technology that is used to boost performance of dynamic languages. Well, actually, not just dynamic languages. It could be any kind of language that doesn't compile all the way to machine code. So even if we look at the languages like Java, which is not dynamic in the definition of languages, it also uses JIT, and essentially JIT turns things like Java bytecode, or in the case of PHP intermediate code, and translates it while the application is running into machine code. Usually not the whole thing, but parts of it. And this translation to machine code from the higher level of representation, from whether it's a Java bytecode or PHP intermediate code, those are all things that are under the hood. The bottom line is that the translation to machine code results in a significantly faster execution. Now, I have an illustration to show you a comparison between PHP 7 and PHP 8 in terms of what JIT does for you. And let's get started. So on the left-hand side, we have PHP 7. These are factors which are rendered on the fly, calculated on the fly. And now on the right-hand side, you're seeing the exact same thing with PHP 8 with JIT enabled. Now, if you take a look, the frames per second FPS, it's around 20, while on the left-hand side, it's less than 10. And PHP 8, even though I started it later, well into probably like 10 or more seconds after PHP 7 got started, it actually finished beforehand, because it's more than twice as fast. Now, the reason that I'm showing this to you using this fancy factor generator, it's not just to make it visually nice. It also has to do with the fact that JIT usually doesn't affect the traditional web applications in a similar way to the way it does to the way it influences things like factor generation, which are very CPU intensive. So the unfortunate news is that for WordPress, for most types of usage of WordPress, this JIT engine, even though it's major news and very sophisticated technology, is likely not going to bring you very much value. And you can see actually in the release announcement of PHP 8 on the php.net website, there's actually a graph that compares several tests of PHP 7 versus PHP 8. Well, it's not strictly PHP 7, it's PHP 8 with JIT disabled. De facto, it's very similar to PHP 7 because JIT was really the main performance difference, the main performance initiative in PHP 8. So this straight line here, this vertical line, this is the performance of PHP 8 without JIT. And then we can see all sorts of tests and things like bench.php and microbench.php, which are synthetic benchmarks, as well as nbody and Mendelbot. Mendelbot is also CPU intensive fractal generator, and parsing and all sorts of things that deal heavily with computation. Those show very significant performance gains. There are two types of JIT in PHP 8, the regular JIT and the tasting JIT. Tasting JIT can do some more intelligent things and kind of push performance even higher. And you're seeing some very impressive results with those benchmarks. But as you get to the real-world applications, like WordPress, suddenly it's not quite as impressive. So WordPress, out of the box, if you just flip on JIT, it will actually be slightly slower. Of course, your mileage may vary. This is WordPress plain vanilla, hello world, without any plugins. So if nobody basically runs WordPress this way, I think. So if you start rolling in plugins and use them in all sorts of ways, maybe there's going to be a difference. Maybe it will actually be slower. Maybe it will be a bit faster. But it's not going to radically change your life. And you can see that this is not really, WordPress does nothing really special about WordPress in that sense. Also, MediaWiki, which is another popular application written in PHP, also doesn't get anything directly from JIT. With tasting JIT, it can get a bit, but it's not a life-changing experience in the way that PHP 7 was for the WordPress workloads, for the common web workloads. At the same time, the main reason JIT was introduced to PHP is to enable other types of workloads and potentially other types of functionality to be implemented into existing workloads. So I'm not ruling out the possibility that WordPress could add future features and capabilities, and maybe plugins will use JIT to do things that were not possible before. But it's not so much like PHP 7 where you just, took the PHP 5 engine out, put the PHP 7 engine in, and suddenly you got 2x performance. It's not going to work quite like that this time around. Going back to what's new in PHP 8. So other than the JIT engine, there's a bunch of new language concepts, quite a lot of them. So there are a lot of type-related elements. I don't know how much exposure this gets, but the main people who are developing and influencing PHP today are very much in favor of strict typing and type safety in general. I have to admit, I'm not one of them. I'm not really a fan of it. The language that Andy Gutmans and Rasmus Lerov and myself created over 20 years ago, the focus was really on the dynamic side of things. That still exists, but you will see that a lot of the new stuff that gets added gives you more and more capabilities around strict typing. So things like union types and mixed types of static types, and the null self operator and some other things. These are all new in PHP 8. I'm not going to dive into each and every one of those. I think that for most of you, it's not going to be, super interesting. But for those of you for whom it is interesting, I'm going to share a link in the end where you can kind of dive more into each and every one of those features. On top of that, there are all sorts of other language constructs which are not type related. So constructor initialization sugar, they're syntactic sugars. So this is something that is actually useful for those of you who write object-oriented code. It's very common in the constructor to essentially have parameters passed to the constructor and then in the constructor body just initialize the object variables from the parameters that were passed. In PHP 8, you now have kind of a standard way of doing it. Let's see if it's covered here. Yeah, so you could, in this case here, class point, instead of having the old style public function construct and have x, y, z x, y, and z passed to it as parameters, and then inside do this x equals x and this y equals y and so on and so forth, you can now just do this, and it will know that x is supposed to be initialized by the parameter x that will be passed. So it's quite nice. It's nice syntactic. Sure, it doesn't allow you to do anything you couldn't do before, but it does save you a bit of typing and does improve code clarity, I think. Attributes which allow you to add metadata onto functions and other types of language constructs. It's kind of like similar to PHP doc, but in a more standardized, and allows you to also access this metadata in a structured way. Trading common parameters. So in function definitions, you can now have a comma at the end. It will just be silently ignored. Named arguments, which is nice. You can pass arguments by name instead of just by the order of the relative order of the argument, and so on and so forth. All sorts of things which improve or give you the ability to do certain things. Usually not things that you couldn't do before, but give you better ways maybe to do those things in a clear or more efficient way. And finally, even though this is kind of very tactical, these I suspect are going to be very popular. So there's a bunch of new Sting functions that I at least over the years found myself wanting to use, and never enough to actually do something about it. But finally in PHP 8 something was done about it, and you have them built into the language. So I did mention that you can go and see a full list, and you can see it here. You can see it in the nice PHP 8 release announcement. This is it, by the way. This is the PHP 8 release announcement. So it does have a pretty good, solid list of all of the features. There's actually another place on Stitcher.io that is a bit more, it's not more comprehensive. It has pretty much the same list, but there's a bit more meat and data for every new feature. So you can take a look at this one if you want to dive in a bit more into each and every one of those new features. Now, other than the JIT engine and the new features, which so far I think it kind of sounds like maybe not super effective, but it's also not too bad. I think there actually is a bit of an elephant in the room, and this time it's not just the standard PHP elephant. I suspect, and based on initial feedback that I received from a bunch of different people, I think it's relatively fair to assume that folks should be worried about migrating to PHP 8 if they have existing apps. I mean, if you're starting from scratch, then PHP 8 is awesome. If you are migrating an existing workload to PHP 8, and I suspect that all of you are because you're using WordPress, then you shouldn't just, maybe let me quickly jump back to the release announcement. There's a call to action here. Go update to PHP 8. No, don't do it just yet. Why? Because basically you'd be entering a world of pain. In addition to all of those new features and optional stickness, there's actually quite a bit of stickness added to PHP 8, which is not optional. Lots of it. And I guess it's divided to two main categories. And I'm not going to try and kind of give you an exhaustive list, but I will point you to articles that do try to give you an exhaustive list. But those two categories are, in a nutshell, the removal of anything that was deprecated in PHP 7.0, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, or 7.4. So anything that was deprecated in the 7.x releases is now removed. So the way PHP releases work is that when there's a decision to deprecate a feature, then it's not immediately removed in the upcoming release. It gets a deprecation notice typically. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just mentioned in the docs or something like that. But usually it gets a deprecation notice. So if you will use it, you will get some sort of a notice, which conveniently you can disable. And I believe even until recently, the default was not to display deprecation notices. But I'm not sure that I'm correct. But regardless, it was and still is possible to suppress those messages. And we accumulate those features that get deprecated, and then in the next major release, it is permissible, according to our rules, to remove them. In PHP 8, everything that was deprecated beforehand was removed, and that by itself can add quite a bit of stickness / headache for migration. Because if you're using a feature that was deprecated, well, maybe you were aware of that it was deprecated, maybe you were not even aware that it was deprecated because you didn't have the deprecation messages configured to be displayed or logged. Or maybe a few years ago, you saw this deprecation message, you didn't do anything about it. And when I'm saying you, it's not just you personally. It could be any of the plugin developers or the WordPress code developers or any other PHP app you might be using. If they decide not to do anything about it and they just, like in the installation docs said, just, disable deprecation notices, then now it's payday. Essentially, if you migrate to PHP 8, you'll no longer be able to ignore those messages and suppress them. It will just error out. It will, if the feature is missing, then it will just behave as if it's missing. And if some of the notices are just promoted to errors, so the execution of the code will stop. So that is the first category. The second category is arguably maybe even more challenging, because this is stickness that was introduced in PHP 8 and there was no real way to prepare for it. Things like validating types of arguments that are passed to internal functions. This is a big one, arguably probably the biggest issue. In PHP 7, those types would just get juggled and converted. In PHP 8, and manage to you can still hear me. So in PHP 8, in some cases you'll get errors, which means that execution will stop. What makes it even more challenging is that there's often no way to really tell whether your app is compatible with PHP 8 or not, other than going through very rigorous QA. In some cases, there are things that you can do some searches and get a sense for, to what level you're affected. But in many other cases, the only way to know whether you're affected or not is to go through a full, very deep QA cycle to essentially try and reach every corner of the code and make sure, and not just every corner of the code, but every possible reasonable kind of input to that code. And only once you do that, which let's be honest, nobody ever really does, then essentially you can be sure that you're not affected. So that means, in my mind, that it will take a fairly long while before gigantic apps or ecosystems, even like WordPress, can truly say that they are compatible. There's going to be probably a lot of work on WordPress core. There's probably going to be a lot of work on plugins. And I think there's going to be also, now that the rubber is finally beginning to hit the road, we may find that there are sometimes situations where it's not possible to create code that is both running well on PHP 8 and compatible with PHP 7. I'm hoping those will not be too common, and maybe I'm wrong and they won't exist at all. But if they do exist, we'll see what we can do about them, and then potentially come up with some solutions, maybe tweaks to PHP 8, maybe even release an intermediate release of PHP 7 that allows you to do this migration. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. If you want to learn a bit more about it, I think that this is where you should go. bit.ly/Yoast PHP 8 WP. It's a blog post, pretty comprehensive blog post from the Yoast CTO that really dove into this and tried to find a lot of the compatibility issues and compatibility categories between WordPress and PHP 8. There's a lot of them. We can see here. It's just take a look at this list. So there's a lot to chew on in terms of the compatibility of PHP 8 and WordPress. And another article you can read is from WordPress.org itself, which is titled WordPress and PHP 8. That also gives you a slightly higher level view of the situation. So to recap that the presentation side of things, I think PHP 8 is going to be a more challenging major version for WordPress and for the PHP ecosystem in general, for the existing workload. But at the same time, it has a lot of interesting features. So, you'll have to decide for your own how quickly you migrate. Definitely, my recommendation is don't, not that I think you would have anyway, but don't kind of drop off from this session, go back to your keyboard and upgrade your server to PHP 8 and hope for the best. It's not going to be a very good strategy. I think a wait and see approach, letting the WordPress core developers hash out most of the compatibility issues, let plugin developers have some time hashing out compatibility issues, probably in the range of, I don't know, a few months to maybe a year, there's going to be a reasonable level of compatibility where you'd be able to toy with the idea to start using PHP 8 for WordPress. It could end up taking even longer than that, but we'll have to see. It's difficult to make predictions about it. So for now, if there are any questions, I guess we'll go back. I think I'm going to end the live chat, or sorry, the live video, the live presentation, and I'm now going to go to the channel and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.